Hi everybody, and welcome to my next slightly overdue video. I do apologise for not posting this originally on the 2nd of May as planned. Unfortunately, on Monday the 1st of May, I had my first ever bilateral shoulder dislocation, so both shoulders went at once, which was a really fun experience, as I'm sure you can imagine. Wasn't just my shoulders that went, two fingers, there's two there, and my right knee as well. And I've got to be honest, had it not been for some very kind, very helpful people, I would have sat there completely immobile until the rapture. And one gentleman in particular, who I won't name, but was kind enough to sort of help me manipulate my right arm back into a good enough position that I was then able to use it to get the left arm back and then my knee back and things. But that still took about 2.5 hours, maybe a little bit over, which wasn't overly fun. Luckily, I didn't need the bathroom at the time, otherwise, as I'm sure you can imagine, that could have been quite a messy experience as well. What it also meant was I ended up having to take more painkillers than I normally would in a day, because it was getting later in the day. It was a particularly excruciating experience, and it meant that Tuesday, so yesterday, which is 2nd of May, I was then left without medication, effectively. So I had about a 44-hour window where I didn't have any pain relief, which was a particularly unpleasant experience, as I'm sure you can imagine. So I managed to get my medication this morning, usual prescription, and obviously I've taken the appropriate dose, and I'm feeling, consequently a bit better. I'm still not feeling 100%, I'm still in agony as always, but I'm certainly feeling a darn sight better than I did, 12 hours ago. So today's video is going to be a very quick one. I know that's kind of not really standard for myself. I know they tend to go on a little bit, but in this video I want to talk about the objectives of the campaign before I then go on with further videos sort of talking about the NHS issues from a patient's point of view, and sort of societal prescriptions for those issues and things that we as patients can do to also help out the NHS. The objectives I have really are twofold, and one is relating to myself directly, and another one does relate to myself, but more in a kind of category of people, category of individuals. So obviously the first objective with this campaign is for me to get the medication that I need. Obviously, if you've watched my previous videos, you'll be aware of my situation. You'll know that in the not too distant future, we're talking months, the current level of medication is not going to be sufficient, and that's in the words of my own doctors, and that's going to worsen my disability, which is going to lower my ability to look after myself, which is already, if I'm honest, quite tenuous. And then, it's gonna cause a world of problems. It's also going to put quite a burden on the health service as well, if we're being honest about it. We should be frank about these things and say that putting somebody like myself into long-term care facilities is very expensive. It's more expensive than sending somebody to prison. I think the last figure I saw, and it was several years ago now, said that the average UK prisoner costs something like £40,000 to £45,000 a year, and NHS care is more expensive than that. So you've got generic medication on one hand that costs a couple of quid a day, and on the other hand you've got a couple of quid a day at most, and on the other hand you've got care that might total 60, 70, 80, 90,000 pounds a year, and you've got that obviously for the rest of my natural born days, because as we've discussed with EDS, it's not a life, or my particular type of EDS, hypermobile Ehlers-Danlos syndrome, it's not a life-ending condition. People with vascular EDS and things like that can be, particularly if it's not picked up quickly, it can be fatal. But for the majority of EDS sufferers, it's not a fatal condition unless, for example, you're unlucky enough to dislocate crossing a road and then you're getting squashed by a bus or something. But that's not exactly a natural death. The second part of this is the second objective is changing the way that chronic pain is viewed. The Office of National Statistics, so that's an independent it's run by the government, but it's supposedly apolitical. They're there just to put out the basic figures and things like that about society. The Office of National Statistics is very clear that Ehlers-Danlos, Ehlers-Danlos is obviously a disability, but they're very clear that chronic pain is one of the most common disabilities in the UK. Now, obviously, there's a lot of conditions out there that cause disabilities. There's conditions that cause mental health disabilities, learning disabilities, physical disabilities, neurological disabilities, and there are obviously people out there that have a combination of those, which is obviously difficult for them to manage. Now, obviously, chronic pain is not a particularly sexy disability, and I know that sounds funny, but the reality is, with conditions like cancer, you win or you lose. There are some forms of cancer, some forms of bone cancer and things with modern medications that can be kept in abeyance for a decade or more. So it's almost like drawing for a long if you compare it to sports, drawing for a prolonged period of time, and then from there, people being then winning or losing. Same with heart disease. You win or you lose. It's either made manageable or it kills you. As awful as that sounds, there's a lot of conditions out there that meet that criteria. And because cancer and heart disease are such big effectors of the population, you would struggle to find many people out there that would not have a friend, a colleague, a family member, a partner, an ex-partner, something like that, a child, heaven forbid, that had experienced one of these conditions at some point in their life. I myself, know of family members that have had heart attacks, had strokes. I also know of family members that have had cancer. So, it's one of those. The common parlance, a common phrase in the UK is that there's three things that get passed down in families. It's cancer, heart disease, and mental illness. Obviously, I'm really pleased with how mental illness awareness and things like that's come on in the last several years, and I'm speaking from personal experience as well. Somebody that has fought with chronic depression really for the last 14 to 15 years, I would say, and a lot of that is down to my condition. EDS does affect the way your brain processes certain chemicals and helps cause it, but also I challenge anybody to live in chronic pain for a prolonged period of time or any period of time and not become depressed about that situation. However, chronic pain is a big issue in the UK. Now, part of that is because people live longer. Part of that is because there are medical treatments that now keep people alive when 20, 30, 40 years ago they would have passed away. Part of it is that more people are surviving very serious accidents that, again, 20, 30, 40 years ago would have been fatal. And the cost of that, in some cases, is nerve damage or damage to parts of the brain that process pain or things like that, or a combination of those, and that's most unfortunate. If you ask most people honestly if they would accept a bit of pain every single day to continue their life, then they would take that deal. The problem starts to become, as we've seen, is when the pain is more than a little, and obviously pain level is subjective. There are some people out there with very high pain thresholds. A number of people have said to myself, obviously, that they'd imagine I have a very high pain threshold, and I remember being young and having a pretty reasonable tolerance to pain, but it's certainly developed over the years, as I'm sure everybody can imagine. And there are people out there that don't have the highest threshold to pain. From my understanding and my reading, biological ladies, so people with the XX chromosome, tend to have, on average, a higher pain threshold than men do, and I'd imagine a certain part of that is down to that kind of genetic memory and programming around childbirth. Now, the problem with chronic pain is that treatment hasn't really advanced for a long period of time. I am a big student of history. Something I nerd out about and things like that, particularly military history, and particularly naval military history. And obviously I've read lots about the Napoleonic Wars, and prior to that and post that, things like that. And back then, when sailors had pieces of wood embedded in their arms or legs or things from or parts of their limb blown off by cannon shells because of the risk of infection, they just took the limb off. It was the easiest and safest way to do it. and the medication often used was laudanum. They were given laudanum by the physician on the boat and on the ship, and then they were operated on as quickly as humanly possible, because back then they didn't have the dissociative anesthetics that we do today that allow us to knock people out, and people would die from shock. Now, laudanum was an opiate. Heroin, most people don't know this, but heroin was effectively invented in the same week that the modern aspirin that we take was. Although salicylic acid, which is one of the main ingredients in aspirin, was in use even back to the Egyptian period of time, there were issues with it. It enfeebled the heart and things like that. But in the space of a week, in the German chemical industry, in the very late 1800s, early 1900s, aspirin and heroin were invented in the same week. And ironically, because of the old issues around salicylic acid, as I've just said, they originally only wanted to market the heroin. So we have had some developments in the opiate market. I mean, we've all heard plenty about oxycodone and Purdue Pharma and things like that. We've also heard pretty much in the last couple of years about fentanyl and things like that as well. But in reality, the majority of medications for pain are ex-epilepsy medications. They're antidepressants. They're medications that were never designed for pain. They have been found after approval to be also useful in that theatre. So the treatment is pretty archaic by many standards. Now, obviously, there is the more behavioural and mental health focused element, and that is a big help for a lot of people with chronic pain. But the reality is, if we boil it down to the simplest explanation, it's about teaching them to live with it. And call me a bit of a cynic, but I think asking somebody to live in a lot of pain for a number of years it's quite a hard thing to do, and I think it's very difficult to look them in the eye and ask them to do that if you've not actually lived in that kind of pain yourself. I mean, it's, breaking a leg or breaking an arm or breaking is painful, and it's very unpleasant, and people tend to remember that kind of pain. But there is a difference with it, because in the back of your mind you're like, well, it's broken, but once it gets sorted, the pain will go away and the pain will get better. In a couple of weeks' time, I'll be fine. Whereas going to bed every night going, well, I'm going to be in agony tomorrow, and waking up the next morning feeling the agony and lather, rinse, repeat, that's quite arduous. So the second objective really is about kind of changing the narrative around chronic pain, changing the approach, and trying to get the relevant medical authorities to actually start looking at it as the serious issue that it is. And I'm not talking about money. I know there's lots of issues around the NHS and money, and I'll be talking about that in future videos. But I'm saying that, we need to seriously start looking at how we treat it, because the societal cost of chronic pain, in terms of welfare payments, in terms of disability, in terms of the damage to lives, and in terms of the death toll, indirectly, as we've talked about before, it's a pretty high price to pay, considering how little is actually invested in treating it, managing it, and how often, in the words of a GP friend of mine, it is generally up to the general practitioner. So for those not in the UK, the primary care doctor, the family doctor, it's predominantly up to them, and that's not their specialism, and they're kind of left groping around in the dark as the best way to treat these patients, and it's not overly well covered at medical school. They spend more time kind of being warned about drug-seeking behaviour than about the kind of people who, yes, are seeking drugs, but are seeking drugs for valid reasons. And it's a bad combination all the way around. It takes up a lot of doctor time. It takes up a lot of appointments with the primary care doctors. It takes up a lot of people's time. And if we use myself as an example, because of issues that I had earlier in the week, it left me very unproductive yesterday because I was suffering with serious side effects. And that's not a good position for anyone to be placed in. So I'm looking at the clock in front of me as well, and I realise that I've said, it'll be a short video, and we've gone on for almost 15 minutes. But it's important to cover the objectives. And obviously the first one, being a bit selfish, is, I want the treatment I need. I fought for a darn long time in this situation, and I don't think I'm asking a lot to get medication that is already approved, is cheap, easily available, obviously through legal channels, and would genuinely make a difference to my life. And I also want to see perhaps the health authorities listen more to people like myself, people who know what they're talking about when it comes to the challenges of living in chronic pain. And hopefully we can change it for the people out there that are suffering every single day and sadly are often suffering in silence. So thanks very much for your time. I'll speak to you all again soon, and I hope you have a lovely day. Bye.